Hey everybody, welcome to Localism, the podcast that asks if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your host and guy who loves blue raspberry candy no matter how many microplastics they put in it, Blunchley. On today's episode, a third legal arrow in our quiver for achieving localism, one that would be pretty tricky to use but has some interesting potential. This third arrow is something that I'm calling state separation. What is state separation? Well, let's jump right in and I'll tell you. Let's not keep my lovely listeners in suspense. What I'm calling state separation is the act of carving a bit of territory out of an existing state in order to make a brand new state. Thus the name, you are separating the new state away from the old one. This is also sometimes called partition, but I like the term state separation more, so I'll stick with that. Unlike most or all of the stuff I normally yap about on here, state separation is actually a surprisingly popular idea. At least in certain niche political corners anyway. A lot of the big states seem to produce the idea. Take California, which still has supporters of the Six Californias idea, a concept that would have carved up the Bear Republic into 6 smaller cubs. This was a serious enough idea that some people actually went around gathering signatures to put it on the ballot in California, but it didn't get enough support. Staying in California, if you go to the northern part, and I mean the true northern part, the Sierra foothills, not the Bay Area, you'll find a decent chunk of households flying the green State of Jefferson flag, showing their support for the idea of making a new state out of parts of Northern California and Southern Oregon. And as of 2024, 13 of Oregon's eastern counties have come out in favor of separating from the rest of Oregon, though technically they want to leave and join Idaho rather than become their own state. In modern times, similar notions have been floated in states like Florida, Illinois, New York, Nevada, and Washington. There's a certain characteristic that most of these states share that you listeners have probably picked up on, but we'll get back to that a little later. Now, I'm sure you're asking, what the hell does chopping up current states have to do with localism? Most of the people clamoring for state separation support it for unrelated reasons. What makes state separation a useful tool for localism? Great question. Remember that localism is all about expanding local authority. Not to beat a dead horse, we've covered this a bunch of times in prior episodes, but there are basically 2 possible paths localism could take. One, absolute localism, just straight up turns the pyramid of preemption upside down and makes a law of local government preempt any inconsistent state and local law, except for the Bill of Rights and certain parts of the federal constitution, which are so cool that we want to keep them around. The other, reformist localism, doesn't mess with the relationship between local and federal law, but gives local governments the ability to legislate in the area of matters of local concern without being preempted by state law, and also involves passing a kind of state-level 10th Amendment that allows local governments to exercise any powers not expressly delegated to state governments. Both forms of localism also involve reforming local political procedures to make them more directly democratic, thereby increasing the ability of average people to exercise actual political agency by making their voices heard in the forums directly within their own communities, rather than trying to compete against corporate interests for influence over career politicians in distant state and federal capitals. No matter what form of localism you're interested in pursuing, that pursuit is going to involve altering the relationship between state and local government, either by making local law preempt state law outright, or doing the matters of local concern plus 10th Amendment stuff. And one way to do that, as we've discussed, is to amend state constitutions. But that route does carry some problems. For one, the business-as-usual corporatism and party cronyism of current state governments are so bad that maybe it's better for supporters of something different to forge out on their own, make something truly new from the ground up. You could implement localism when you draft the original constitution for your new state and live in a political community that has localism entwined in its existence from the very start. For another, if you were to amend the state constitution, the localist change you made would affect the entire state. It should be obvious I'm a big proponent of localism, but I also recognize that there are lots of people who would have very principled reasons not to want to embrace it. And if those people lived in a state where the constitution was changed to implement localism, there could be people in communities who get stuck under a political system they diametrically oppose. State separation allows supporters of localism to tailor localist reforms to those communities that actually support them, i.e., those communities willing to separate into a new state and then organize that state in accordance with localist principles. Third, unlike the state and federal forays into amending constitutions for localism, state separation is able to more directly leverage current political trends to generate support for the idea of separation. There are specific aspects of the political climate that, in my view, make state separation an eminently achievable tactic and arguably a far more practical path to localism than the other methods discussed thus far. In order to tee up what those contemporary political aspects are, And in order to introduce us to the actual legal process for how state separation can be achieved, I'm going to talk about a piece of American history that, for once, is not some obscure piece of legal trivia that exactly pencil pushers like myself have ever heard of. So it's the end of the Revolutionary War. The colonies have just become the United States of America. One particularly influential state is Massachusetts. That's partially because a great many of the founding fathers had connections to Boston or Massachusetts more broadly, but it's also because Massachusetts controlled a valuable asset, the then northernmost part of America. What we know today as the state of Maine was originally called the District of Maine, a legal construction made so that Massachusetts could more easily manage these large northern counties. The District of Maine was full of patriotic revolutionaries who had fought in the war against the British and was particularly known as a hub for patriot privateers to attack British supply ships. Feeling that they had more than contributed their share to the country's birth, and frustrated by a state government that often served the interests of distant merchants in Boston rather than the more rural citizens of the District of Maine, the people within the district began to agitate for their own state almost immediately after the war ended. Furthermore, despite the citizens of the District of Maine having to pay state taxes, they had no representation in the Massachusetts state legislature. There had just been a little kerfuffle over the whole taxation without representation thing, so it's not surprising that people were starting to grumble. Starting in 1792, the District of Maine had no less than 5 popular votes on the issue of whether to support from Massachusetts. Then came the War of 1812. Putting aside their grudges with Massachusetts, which was often seen as a hotbed for pro-British sentiment, the Maine district citizens turned to deal with the war. During the war, parts of Maine were occupied by the British, and because Maine was a distant and relatively low-populated part of the country, it was not a high priority for military or economic relief from either the federal or state government. Some of Maine's coastal towns were outright plundered by the British. The British had so much control that they even carved out some of Maine's territory to make the short-lived British colony of New Ireland, which was only returned to Maine in America when the war was over. Some citizens of the District of Maine felt they'd been hung out to dry by their state government, and bad feelings hardened. With this new motivation to go their own way, the topic of separating from Massachusetts and making the district its own state came up to vote once again. This time, it worked. In addition to lingering resentment over the War of 1812, this success was also due to some clever politicking that got the federal Congress to eliminate what was called the coasting law, a shipping law that required ships from one state to stop and pay fees in each state they did not share a border with. This law had made coastal interests in Maine opposed to the idea of separating from Massachusetts, as once separated, Maine could no longer claim to share borders with New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. By getting the coasting law killed, the coastal parts of the District of Maine had no reason to oppose separation anymore, and thus the vote for state had passed with a whopping 70% of voters supporting separation. So the Massachusetts state government is cool with it. Is that all? Do we have a new state? No. This is where the story goes from scrappy frontiersmen and salesmen in Maine forging their own path to cold-hearted realpolitik and a shameful stain on the nation's history. See, in order for Maine to truly become a state, it needed to be admitted to America by the federal Congress. But Congress wasn't all that interested in adding Maine to the list of states. That's because Maine was a firmly anti-slavery state. 2 more anti-slavery senators would have shattered the uneasy balance of power that had developed in Congress over that issue. So despite Massachusetts officially accepting Maine's status as a separate state, it looked like the whole effort might be doomed by national political currents that most people in Maine both despised and had no control over. But then, federal politicians found a way forward in a devil's bargain that you'll likely remember from your middle school history classes. Another state was in the middle of attempting to gain admission, a state that did not share Maine's qualms about treating people like chattel. That state was Missouri. The horse trading math worked out. If both states could be admitted as a package deal, then the current equilibrium of slave versus not slave states would still be maintained. Thanks to this bargain, which became known as the Missouri Compromise, Maine was finally able to achieve its decades-long goal of state separation. The Missouri Compromise is a dark chapter of our history. It was premised on the institution of slavery, America's original sin. But it is also a very instructive chapter. It shows that state separation is possible, especially when people in part of a state grow disillusioned with a distant state capital that isn't responsive to their needs, values, or interests. It shows that if you can make economic interests, or at least perceived economic interests, align with state separation, you are more likely to succeed. And it shows that state separation is never just a one-state affair. It is inextricably bound up with national politics, and admission can only be achieved either in a situation where one party has near total control of Congress and the presidency, which is unlikely, or when the impact of admitting a new state can be mitigated by admitting another state simultaneously with exactly opposite political leanings. The story of how Maine became a state also gives us a rough outline of the process for state separation. First a statewide vote, then a federal vote. Let's clean up that rough outline a bit and actually look at the legal process that governs how state separation and state admission are achieved. It's time to check in with our old friend, the federal Constitution, because it has all the answers we seek. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 is the bit that we care about for our purposes here. It reads, "New states may be admitted by the Congress into this Union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states, or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned as well as of the Congress." Now let's unpack that word salad. State separation is a two-step process. First, part of a current state declares that it wants to break away from its home and become a new state. Second, that state has to then actually be admitted into America. Article 4 provides instructions on how to accomplish both of these steps. Let's actually start with that admitted into America bit first. Article 4 makes it clear that it's Congress that's the body responsible for deciding whether to admit a new state into the Union. The way this works is actually just that Congress passes an otherwise normal law that says, okay, this area is a state now. The fact that states are admitted via the normal federal legislative process has a few interesting consequences. First, it means that unlike other big name changes like amending the Constitution, you can admit a state based on a simple majority vote in both houses of Congress, no supermajority required. In fact, if the political party that supports admitting a new state has control of the vice presidency, then technically all you need is a majority in the House of Representatives and a tie in the Senate. Second, because states are admitted via federal laws, like any other, the law that admits a state can be vetoed by the president. This is something that has actually happened in American history, for example, when President Taft vetoed Arizona's admission to the U.S. in 1911. If you'll permit me a small diversion, the reason why President Taft vetoed Arizona's admission to the U.S. in 1911 was because the proposed constitution for Arizona allowed state judges to be recalled. In other words, allowed citizens to submit petitions that would force state judges to resign. Taft considered this provision unacceptable because he viewed it as compromising the integrity and independence of the judiciary. Heaven forbid judges have a little accountability to normal people, right? To be fair, Taft probably cared about this so much because he himself was a really accomplished judge, having served on the Sixth Circuit and as America's Solicitor General prior to becoming president. And after he left the presidency, he'd become the first and only American to be on the Supreme Court after being president. Anyway, the objectionable judge recall provision of the state constitution got removed, and Taft said, okay, fine, I won't veto any rule that admits Arizona, and then Arizona got admitted in 1912. Hilariously, though, the state citizens then went on to amend their state constitution to add back in the recall provision once Arizona's admission was secured. Okay, anecdote over. Where were we? Right, states are admitted by normal congressional legislation, and the president can veto that legislation. Another consequence of the system is that in order to admit a new state all by its lonesome, i.e. without a new state that has opposite political leanings to balance things out, the new state must be from the same political makeup as both houses of Congress and the president. In other words, if you're admitting a new state that's going to mostly vote Republican, you'll need a Republican president and a Republican-controlled Congress, and the same goes if you're admitting a new state that votes Democrat or whatever. If you don't completely control the legislative and executive branches, then either Congress will refuse to vote to admit the state, or the president will veto any law admitting the state. Alternatively, you could construct a veto-proof majority in Congress that would support admission, but in today's political climate, it's hard to think of a situation where a political party could line up a supermajority in Congress, but somehow wouldn't control the presidency. So that's the process for admitting a new state. Just pass a federal law and don't have it get vetoed, stupid. But what about the extra wrinkle that state separation isn't just grabbing territory from elsewhere and adding it to America? Does the fact that the new state is being made from the territory of an old state matter? Yes, it does. The framers didn't want Congress to just be able to yank away states' land against their will and turn them into new states. That felt like it would allow the federal government to intrude too much on state authority. Thus, Article 4 specifies that you can't make a state out of a current state's territory unless you get, quote, the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned. Remember how in the story of Maine, before Maine was even able to get to the stage of federal admission, there was a popular referendum and the Massachusetts state legislature passed a law acknowledging Maine's existence as a separate state? That was done to show that Massachusetts was consenting to Congress making a new state using Massachusetts as territory. And now we have a fuller picture. To achieve state separation, first you need to get the home state's legislature to agree to let part of its territory peel away and become a new state. Second, you need Congress to vote to pass a law admitting that new state. Third, you need the president not to veto that law. Bing, bang, boom. All of Article 4's boxes checked, all good. Right? Well, arguably not quite. It's time to bring up a bit of a strange wrinkle introduced by a part of the Constitution that just keeps seeming to pop up when talking about localism. The Guarantee Clause. We did an entire episode on the Guarantee Clause, which you should listen to, by the way. I think it's one of our most interesting episodes. So I'm not going to repeat all the stuff I said there. But to give you the quick and dirty version, the Guarantee Clause is Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution. In relevant part, it says that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. This means that Congress has the power to ensure that all state governments are small r Republican, in other words, governed via elected representatives that are voted into office by state citizens. Because of Supreme Court cases like Luther v. Borden, we know that one way for Congress to make the political judgment that a state is sufficiently Republican is to admit that state to America. In other words, at the time that Congress is deciding whether or not to admit a new state, it is also making a determination as to whether or not the potential new state's government is sufficiently Republican to satisfy the requirements of the Guarantee Clause. No Republican state government may equal no ability to be admitted to America. Now, also thanks to cases like Luther v. Borden, the current law surrounding the Guarantee Clause is that Congress's judgment as to whether a state is small or Republican is a political question that the courts can't review. This is kind of scary for localism. After all, no matter what form of localism you're trying to accomplish by pursuing state separation, the ultimate result in the new state will be directly democratic local governments that are empowered to call a lot of the shots, while the elected officials in the state capital play a smaller role. As we discussed during the Guarantee Clause episode, the structure of government fits uncomfortably within the definition of small r Republican, and arguably doesn't fit within that definition at all. Since Congress's powers under the Guarantee Clause aren't super well defined, and since Congress's political judgments under the Guarantee Clause aren't reviewable, this presents some pretty disturbing possibilities for states that reform their current government and move towards one that is more democratic, for example, localism. Say Nebraska decides to fully embrace reformist localism by amending a state constitution to add a provision saying all powers not delegated to the state government remain with local governments, and that local governments can legislate in a broadly defined area of matters of local concern without being preempted by state laws. At the same time, Nebraska counties and municipalities perform their local governments to operate upon proxy-based directly democratic principles. Then imagine that a Democratic Congress, not happy at all with this innovation in a Republican state and seizing the chance to try and push for regime change, passes a law giving the president the authority to restore the small r Republican nature of a state government that has strayed into democracy. This authority extends to the president, directing the DOJ and FBI to actively interfere in Nebraska's rule by forcibly returning the government to the form it was in prior to the localist reforms. The president can even federalize the National Guard to quote-unquote restore order by imposing a small r Republican form of government onto an unwilling state populace and appointing new politicians to serve as representatives until new elections are held. Under this hypothetical law, the president would gain this authority once Congress held a simple majority vote that supported a declaration that a state had ceased to meet the Guarantee Clause definition of Republican. Congress argues that under Luther v. Borden, its judgment on this matter is not reviewable by any court, meaning there is no possible way to sue the government to stop it from meddling in Nebraska's affairs. Is this scenario possible? Maybe. It's really unknown territory. But if there's even a slight possibility of the Guarantee Clause allowing that kind of federal interference with the movement towards localism, we have to take it very seriously, just because of how much of a threat it presents. However, the non-reviewable nature of Congress's exercise of its powers under the Guarantee Clause can also be a double-edged sword that cuts against localism's opponents. The other edge of that sword arises specifically when, instead of performing an existing state government to be localist by passing new legislation or amending the state constitution, you get the federal Congress to admit a new state that is localist from the outset. The central holding in Luther v. Borden was that the Rhode Island Royal Charter, which was basically aristocratic and had a property requirement for voting, did not render Rhode Island a non-small r Republican state. Because Congress had admitted it to America, and congressional admission of a state represents a non-judicially reviewable judgment by Congress that a state's current form of government meets the requirements of the Guarantee Clause. So if you can get Congress to agree to admit your state that's organized along localist principles from the outset, then bam, your state passes muster under the Guarantee Clause. This is a small benefit of using state separation to achieve localism in America rather than other methods we discussed that instead reform how a current state's government works. Once your new localist state is in, and assuming that you then don't modify the form of government in the future to make it less small r Republican, then your state is quote-unquote Republican, no matter how democratic things may be at the local level. The upshot here is this. My non-expert recommendation is that we should treat the Guarantee Clause as functionally adding an additional prerequisite to state admission and thus state separation. That requirement is that a candidate for statehood needs to have a state constitution drafted ready to go in the event of admission, and that the Constitution should provide for a state government with all the usual stuff, a governor, system of courts, legislature with elected representatives, etc. This seems like a reasonable way to at least try and hedge against any potential guarantee clause concerns. It's also in line with historical practice, as my understanding is that pretty much every state had a state constitution and a governor plus legislature plus court system of government when they were first admitted, except for maybe some of the original colonies. And since the state constitution for your newly admitted localist state puts most authority in your and your community's hands by providing a broad authority to local government, the ability of all these small R Republican institutions to mess around in local governments and thus your community's self-determination will be limited. So that gives us the full legal process to achieve state separation. First, hold a popular referendum in the part of the state that wants to break away and have the state government pass a law that provides consent to losing its territory. Second, have the people in this bit of territory that just separated draft up a proposed state constitution and make sure that constitution sets out localist reforms as well as providing for a small R Republican state legislature. Third, get Congress to pass a law admitting the separated territory as a brand new state and make sure the president doesn't veto that law. Now that we know more or less the process for achieving the state separation, let's jump into the realm of realpolitik for a bit. Remember that if a new state is being admitted alone, then that state's voters need to belong to a political party that controls both houses of Congress and the presidency. That's pretty unlikely, right? So it probably would instead be best to follow on in the steps of Maine and find a Missouri equivalent for the new separated state. In other words, admit two separated states with opposite political leanings simultaneously, thereby maintaining the balance of power at the federal level. Thankfully, we are no longer divided on the issue of whether slavery is bad, at least I hope so. So in modern day terms, this means that in order to achieve state separation, we're going to have to admit both a Republican and a Democrat state at the same time. Separately, in order for you to achieve state separation, the part of the state you're spinning off is probably going to have to be somehow undesirable to the political party currently in charge of your state government. Imagine that you want to do state separation in an fictional state we'll call Coolsville, named after a friend of the pod, Judge Cooley. Coolsville is split pretty much dead down the middle between Democrats and Republicans, but at the moment, Republicans have a very tiny majority in the state legislature, and there's a Republican governor. Imagine that groups from several Republican counties start agitating for them to be able to separate from Coolsville and be admitted to America as a new state. There is no way in hell that the state government is going to let that happen. If those counties and their voters leave, the slim majority Republicans currently control would evaporate, and the Democrats would be the ones in power. So these Republican counties don't have a chance of getting the state government to sign on to their plan to become a separate state. But if instead of being Republican, this group of counties was controlled by Democrats, then the state government would love nothing more for these counties to go away. Them being pushed out of the state is to Republicans' advantage and increases that party's power within the state of Coolsville. So what's the takeaway? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you want to succeed in achieving state separation, given the way things currently are in America, the easiest path to do so is by carving out a conservative rural part of an otherwise liberal state. Let me explain. Let's start with the state-level considerations. Like I mentioned earlier, the best way to get a state on board with letting part of its territory say goodbye is to choose a piece of territory that is politically or otherwise undesirable. Fortunately, or I guess unfortunately, if you're a fan of people getting along and being kind to one another, there is a massive current divide in state-level politics that state separation can easily parasitize on. This divide renders pretty much large swaths of territory both undesirable and unprofitable for the political parties controlling certain state governments. And the nature of the differences in the areas on either side of this divide are such that the people who live there either dislike or outright despise each other. This divide I'm referring to is the urban-rural divide, and specifically the urban-rural divide in states that are somewhat large geographically, whose average square mile is nevertheless conservative, and that have one or more large urban liberal centers that have such large populations that these urban centers effectively dictate policy to the entire state. Think your New Yorks, your Californias, your Virginias, and Oregons and Washingtons, and Nevadas. You may note that several of those states are ones I mentioned earlier this episode when talking about existing state separation movements. That's right, conservatives. This episode is low-key about you and your frustrations and how to achieve some of your political objectives. The reason these particular rural and conservative areas make such good candidates is because absent some other overriding consideration, there isn't all that much of a reason for the in-power urban liberals to want to keep them around. They don't bring in much tax revenue. They're full of people who are inconvenient to the state government's agenda. They are often culturally and physically distant from a state's liberal centers. And, of course, a chunk of conservative voters leaving the state further solidifies Democrat control. Meanwhile, the conservative rural areas are more than happy to strike out on their own. They are tired of their votes being overridden by a mass of strangers who live hundreds of miles away. They are tired of what they see as over-moralization, overreach, and over-interference in daily life by the state government. Sure, there's the whole how are we going to afford a new state government when our areas don't put out much tax revenue question to figure out, but paying a bit more in taxes may be well worth the expense if it also means getting to break free from a liberal regime that is callous to their values at best and actively hostile to them at worst. Seriously, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that liberal city dwellers versus conservative rural denizens is the political divide of our time, and that feelings have never run hotter on either side of that divide. If you're a liberal in a Democrat state, if you could snap your fingers and suddenly all the craziest, most partisan conservatives in your state would be pushed out and quarantined into their own state, wouldn't you want to do that? If you're a conservative living in a liberal controlled state, if you could snap your fingers to suddenly be free of the heavy hand of the crazy liberal state government that infringes on your rights and way of life, and instead become part of a new state that is completely solid red, wouldn't you want that? It's a classic win-win situation, at least in terms of pure, cold political calculus. It's true that the urban liberal rural conservative divide is alive and well in Republican controlled states too. Just ask Texans how they feel about the lefties in Austin. But liberal enclaves and otherwise deep red states generally aren't going to make as strong a candidate for state separation if we're solely talking about probability of success. That's because these liberal cities are usually the state's economic engines, providing a disproportionate amount of tax revenue that conservative states rely upon. The thinking goes something like this. You've already got political control of the state, and the big cities are your moneymakers. The annoying libs in these cities are just that, annoying, and nothing more. They are still outnumbered by conservatives. So let them be annoying. Better than letting them leave the state and take their money with them. As a result, even in this acerbic political climate, I suspect that you would see Republicans find reasons to fight tooth and nail to stop Austin if it started lobbying to become its own state. The same is true for other red states if their one or two blue dots tried to go their own way. Notwithstanding this observation, I can imagine some situations where maybe it would be politically expedient to let blue bits of a conservative state escape. For example, maybe your state is one where state constitutional amendments can get proposed by initiative, and maybe all the libs in your state are being annoying and pushing for an amendment that would enshrine a right to abortion, or allow DEI in schools, or something. Now, you could just take the risk that the amendment will lose. But that's a pretty big risk. A lot of these recent constitutional amendments, especially abortion, can have some support with red-tinted moderates who might defect and side with liberals. So why not just cut out a big portion of the liberals who would vote in favor of the amendment by letting them leave the state? The political math might check out for all involved. Conservatives get to reduce the support for the unwanted amendment to a low enough level that it won't pass. The liberals in the spun-off state get a new state government that's completely under their majority control, and where whatever amendment they wanted to pass can be much more easily achieved. Some food for thought, maybe. But let's move on to the political calculus at the federal level, which will only reinforce my point that state separation, or at least the first one or two state separations, will be much more easily achievable with conservative breakaways from liberal states rather than vice versa. So federal realpolitik for state separation. Assuming you agree with my thesis that rural conservative areas and large liberal states make for the best separation candidates, and that the liberal states will have no problem letting a few relatively low population rural conservative areas break away, then there are two paths to then getting these new breakaways admitted to the U.S. by Congress. The first, which you might call the hard way, is just to try and force it through during a time, like now, at which both Congress and the presidency are controlled by Republicans. I call this the hard way because it not only is very rare for conservatives to control both Congress and the president, it's also very unlikely that a liberal state is going to want to hand conservatives the gift of 2 extra senators by letting a new state be made of its own territory. Democrat interests will be leaning on the Democrat state politicians to stop any such effort in its tracks. Now, maybe there is a scenario where the liberal state government and urban liberal populace is truly just so sick of the conservative areas in the state that they just want them out, political consequences be damned, and are willing to work across the aisle and against their own political interests at the federal level to achieve that goal. But that seems very unlikely. So let's go with path 2, which I can't exactly call it the easy route. How about the easier route? This route involves taking a lesson from the Missouri Compromise and trying to admit a new conservative state alongside a new liberal state simultaneously. And wouldn't you know it, there's an area of the country that has been clamoring for statehood for ages, a liberal stronghold that is literally facing taxation without representation and has grown ever more resentful of that fact with every passing year. I'm talking about the District of Columbia. D.C. statehood has been a liberal hobby horse for the better part of half a decade, with D.C. voters in the 80s even voting to call a state constitutional convention and then voting to ratify the resulting draft in 1982. A congressional bill to admit D.C. as a state even made it onto the floor of the House of Representatives in 1993, but it lost. And in 2016, a district-wide referendum was held where a whopping 85% of voters supported the idea of D.C. statehood. Then in 2020, the House of Representatives actually passed an act to admit D.C. But Republicans controlled the Senate, so the bill went nowhere. People in D.C. pretty uncontroversially want statehood. People in a conservative rural area of a liberal state like California want statehood. This is another clear win-win situation. By sticking together a proposed conservative breakaway and D.C. into what I'm calling a Missouri pair, both liberals and conservatives could get what they wanted without disturbing the balance of power in the Senate. And you could even try to make conservative rural areas with a population of around 680,000 people as a new state, thereby balancing out the admission of D.C., which has about the same number of residents. The rural conservatives get to pursue localism and are free of liberal interference. The D.C. citizens finally get to have a place in Congress and have their voices count for something other than just the presidential election. History in the Missouri Compromise tells us that this strategy of conjoining two politically disparate states for simultaneous admission is effective. A little asterisk here, maybe this could also work with Puerto Rico in place of D.C. or in addition to D.C., but to be honest, unlike the idea of statehood in D.C., Puerto Rico's statehood seems, at least from an outside observer, like a much closer issue as to whether it's something that people of Puerto Rico actually want. American control over Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican independence were and are extremely controversial topics. I don't want to speak on behalf of people who are from Puerto Rico and cheerfully join them up for some scheme where many people on the island might not even want to be in America at all. Additionally, Puerto Rico is an island of 3 million people, and it would take a pretty damn huge chunk of conservative rural areas to make a new matching state with 3 million people, so that's another barrier. However, given that Puerto Rican statehood is an established idea, and given that there is an active statehood movement on the island, and given further that a slight majority of Puerto Ricans voted in favor of statehood during a 2024 referendum, at least when the only two options were statehood or not statehood, I wanted to at least acknowledge the possibility that Puerto Rico could serve as the liberal half of a Missouri pair in the same way that D.C. could. And now we truly, finally have the full A to Z for state separation, realpolitik included. Let's break it down. Step 1. Identify a liberal state with a handful of big urban areas that control the entire state's politics, but that also has a lot of deep red conservative areas that resent being controlled by the liberals in the state capital. 2. Convince people on both political sides in the state that it's in everyone's interest for the conservative counties to leave and form their own state. 3. Hold a vote in the state legislature confirming that the conservative rural areas can form their own state. 4. Reach out to interests in Washington, D.C., or maybe Puerto Rico, to coordinate forming a Missouri pair. 5. Draft a new state constitution that both implements localist reforms and creates a state government with an elected legislature, thereby avoiding guarantee clause issues. 6. Have Congress vote to admit the proposed new conservative and liberal states at the same time as a package deal. 7. Keep the president from vetoing the bill. If you manage to thread the needle through that quite difficult path, then the result will be a state that has localism in its DNA from its very conception. One full of people who were committed enough to localism to forge out on their own and pursue it as part of the great American experiment. And in theory, even if the state is full of empowered local governments being operated on directly democratic principles, it should be free from any guarantee clause concerns because of the holding in Luther v. Borden. That's all for today's show. Next time we'll be talking about, well, I don't know yet. This episode about state separation is the last one in the Tools for Achieving Localism mini-arc we've been on for the past 2 months or so. I've got a few ideas for future episodes, the Localism Book Club, where we'll look at different books and authors that I think have written interestingly on topics that are adjacent to localism. There's also the Resilience mini-series, a series of episodes where I would focus more on certain economic or other steps that local governments could take in order to make self-government and really self-independence more of a reality despite the super heavily federalized and globalized system that we live in. I also would really like to do an episode on state and local tax exemptions. You might sometimes hear this referred to as the SALT exemption, and how that does and does not further localism's interests given the current political system we live in. So next episode is going to be a grab bag from one of those 3 topics, or it might be something completely different. I guess you'll just have to see. Stay tuned for the fun surprise topic in a week or 2. I'll put something up on Blue Sky. We have a Blue Sky, by the way. Follow us at @LocalistPod once I've settled on what the next episode will be about. If you enjoyed the show today and want to learn more about the concept of localism, please be sure to catch the next episode on Spotify or YouTube. And feel free to drop me a question or comment at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localist with a T, pod@gmail.com. Catch you then. A huge thank you to Kevin McLeod for letting me use the two songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.